Welcome everybody. For those of you who are frequent viewers of the HousingLIN happy hours, you will have seen that we have a new banner which we're delighted to introduce today, and we've been running these happy hours for ever since the commencement of COVID. And in fact, we started our first ever happy hour series at the outset of COVID in partnership with Winkworth Sherwood. So delighted that Charlotte could join us and chair this afternoon session, which is very much looking at housing diversity and in particular looking through the lens of shared ownership. I'm delighted we've got a great list lineup for you, but rather than me going through it, Charlotte has kindly agreed to chair this afternoon's session. So over to you, Charlotte.
Oh, and I remember to unmute myself. Well done, me. Thank you, Jeremy and Sally, for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be your chair for today's session. As Sally's explained, last time movers, creating more diverse tenure options for the housing for older people market. My name's Charlotte Cook. I'm a partner in the social housing real estate team at Winkworth Sherwood. We've been associated with the HousingLIN for many years, from the outset, pretty much, and very pleased to have been so involved. Hopefully many of you are aware of us. We're a full service legal firm with particular focus in the social housing arena. So I and my colleagues work with and for housing associations, local authorities, almshouses, charities and providers across the social housing spectrum, from the smallest to the largest. We work in all aspects of the real estate market, acquisition and development of housing schemes, management of the same, as well as care and the older persons market for associations, providers, commissioners and operators. They're pretty much everybody involved there. As Jeremy has alluded to, I'm very pleased to welcome here my illustrious panel. We should have two Bens, but there's only one at the moment. Ben Denton shall be joining shortly, I hope. Ben Denton is the Executive Director of the Property and Development team, and Ben Rosewell is the Head of Investment for Later Living at L&G Capital. Also joined by one of my partners at Winkworth Sherwood, Ruth Barnes, who leads our residential development sales team. And Miranda Foster is here, the Head of Affordable Housing Grants at Homes England. Also joined here by Michael Wilson, who is also from Homes England, Senior Manager, Specialist Housing and Delivery. He'll be helping out in the Q&A, so please do make sure you put lots of comments into the Q&A section of this, so we can field those questions at the end of the presentation. I'm sure that you're all very aware of the demographics of the older persons market, people living longer and hopefully living better across the board. With that in mind, one of the questions we've got here for our speakers is, what do they see as the tenure options for older people? Is there opportunity for stimulation of a new housing solution for later time buyers? Or indeed, do people want to buy in later life, or do they prefer to remain in place? Some questions: are people considering moves to alternative accommodation in their later years? Are we in England, Wales, going the way of the Antipodeans and the Americans in the development of retirement villages? Or is that a concept that remains still a little bit alien to us here? We're all eagerly awaiting the report from the Older Persons Housing Task Force. I'm sure that many of you have contributed to the work being carried out there. As you all know, and Jeremy and Ben are sworn to secrecy here, but they're both involved in that. It's been looking at what exists to give greater choice, quality and security of housing for older people, considering the enablers to increase supply and improving housing options for older people in later life. Also looks to explore ways to unblock any challenges to that provision. I'm sure that this is something that's being considered by the task force, but looking also at the anticipated reforms to the property market, and particularly looking at leasehold reform, freehold reform as well. What do our speakers think, or how do our speakers think that's likely to impact on the housing choices available to older people? There's a new leasehold and freehold bill looking to improve consumer choice and fairness in leasehold, crack down on unfair practices and increase the transparency of service charges and administration costs, something that hopefully will feed into the work that we're looking at here. Whether there'll be a reinvigoration of the common hold tenure is something that we'd also look at. Just a format for today, you've got the agenda there. I'll be asking each of our speakers to make their presentations. As I said, asking you please to put your comments into the Q&A box. Once our speakers are done, we'll open up the floor to those questions. So please do contribute, comment or converse. So without further ado, over to the first of the Bens. Ben Rosewell, the floor is, as they say, yours.
Thanks, Charlotte. I think Charlotte provided a good overview of a number of work streams, a number of things that are taking place in the sector. We're all aware we've got an ageing population. They are a very affluent population, and at the moment we have a relatively small sector in the UK. I think there are a huge number of opportunities in this space, but there are also a huge number of challenges. And today we are focusing particularly on tenure, which is a key one, but I think probably it's not a simple, we fix the tenure, we fix the sector. I think there's a huge number of work streams ongoing, and we are actively looking at overseas what's worked. We're also looking at the sector in the UK. There are a number of players there that have been around for some time, and we just need to look at how we are progressing that and what lessons have we learned and what do people want. And I think probably the key thing we are learning is that we really need to focus on what the residents want and what the customers want. So just for background, as Charlotte said, I'm Head of Investment for Later Living Legal and General. We're currently one of the backers behind a platform called Inspired Villages. We have got 14 sites that we're currently either live on, 9 live and 5 under construction. We've got another 3 we own, and then we've got another pipeline of about 10. So we're an active investor in this sector. We're also involved with the operator. So we have a live view of what's going on in the space. All those villages are integrated retirement communities. So they have, restaurants, bars, cafes, swimming pools, a full wellbeing suite, along with a range of accommodation. When that business was set up, as were many of the IRCs in the UK, they were purely a for sales model. And for a long time, that has been how the sector's operated. But as it's evolved, one of the clear points that's come across is that we need more alternative forms of tenure, and particularly because retirement housing, senior living, integrated retirement communities, multiple names, but they are not just real estate, they are operational businesses, and these people are living here. They are coming for much more than just the real estate, and that's one of the key challenges that's been a difficulty for some time, is that you are running the real estate with a leasehold structure on an operational real estate. So we, about 3 years ago, introduced rentals as an alternative structure. That immediately we saw an uptake in that. We're probably currently at the moment running about 15 to 20% of our schemes based on rentals. That is residents choosing just to rent existing units we have without actually making bespoke rental products. I think what we're already seeing is that there is a difference between those that rent and those that buy. In general, the renters are typically older, being around mid-80s. They're usually single, and they are renting smaller, typically 1-bedroom apartments. There's obviously anomalies outside that, but in general, the data that we're seeing is that they are a slightly different demographic probably than what you'll see from the for sales model, which is leading us to therefore look at how we plan our villages going forward. Should we be building bespoke rental product targeting that market? Now that's just one form of change that we've made that is helping drive our businesses and helping respond to customers' requirements. I think what we're fully aware of is that we need more variance in the product. We need more tenure options. We have already heard from some of the agents that have done recent surveys that people are willing to use their household savings to live better, to invest in their future. And so there are various structures in play overseas. We know that others may look to introduce here. I think the challenge is we are going through leasehold reform at the moment. We're looking, there's a strong suggestion that common hold should be the solution. That comes with its own challenges for the sector. Are we at a point where we need to be looking at alternative forms of tenure? a lot of question marks still, but we need to let the leasehold reform go through. But one thing that is definitely clear is that we need more alternative forms of tenure, and we also need more flexibility that recognises that these aren't always just real estate transactions. There's an operational piece there, feeding back into service charges, services provided. And at the moment, the current structure where a lease is locked away, you know, it's agreed when the resident buys the unit and then effectively is in place for 999 years, makes it very difficult to operate in an operating business. The rental has huge advantages over that because you obviously can tailor the rental as you go, but we need more flexible tenure for the operators to drive a better service for their residents, a better outcome and a better value proposition. So we are definitely supportive of that, but, you know, waiting to see what comes from the leasehold reform, what the outcome is of that. But we are constantly looking ourselves at the structures and what we can do working within the current legislative framework. So I think that's probably all I was going to say. I know Ben Denton was going to join me now to share some views on the shared ownership structure, but as far as I can see, he's still not managed to get on. Oh no, I think he's just popped up.
As if by magic, he has just appeared. Are you ready, Bendy? Or otherwise we could swap to Ruth to do a bit of the tenure. No, there you go. He is on mute. Excellent, thank you. Although I can't hear Ben. I don't know if anybody else can.
No, I can't either.
Oh, that's done.
Can you hear that?
Yeah, that's good.
Good.
Lovely.
Right, good. So yes, sorry about that in terms of getting connected. So here I am. So yes, I think, I mean, one of my reflections, just picking up from Ben's comments, is the proportion of shared ownership at the moment that's funded by older person shared ownership. So there was a question in the House of Commons about I think about a year ago, and the average delivery in a year for older person shared ownership is about 240 homes a year of shared ownership for older people, compared to about 25,000 homes that are normally delivered under shared ownership. Obviously, half of that is Section 106, and roughly speaking, half is grant supported shared ownership. So it's a bit disappointing, really, at the end of the day, that 1% of all shared ownership that's delivered at the moment in the country is targeted towards older people. We're obviously an institutional investor in the affordable housing marketplace. We have about, within L&G Affordable Homes, about just over 5,000 homes in operation, and grow at about 2,000 homes a year. The interesting statistic on shared ownership is about 15% of all shared ownership now. The residual strips are owned by institutions. About 10 years ago, it was 0. So institutions are playing quite a large role in the affordable housing marketplace, and particularly in the shared ownership marketplace. Now, that's not to say that shared ownership doesn't have its challenges. For those of you that follow the House of Commons Select Committee, you'll have seen a recent report that came out with concerns about shared ownership and whether it was really working in a way that works for the customer, whether it was affordable in the long term, and also the age-old issue around whether the landlord should be paying for a proportion of the repairs alongside the resident. So that's not to say that shared ownership is a perfect product. There are some improvements that need to be made, not just in relation to the product, but also in relation to the way services are provided to customers. But just picking up my counterpart Ben's point, there is a real need to try and diversify the number of tenure options that exist in the older person's marketplace, to try and crowd in more funding, to allow more homes to be built, to help more.
Oh, I think Ben is once again having. Oh no, he's back.
Oh, come back there. Sorry, I literally finished. So that was my final sentence. Sorry about that. We're jinxed today. Hopefully that was helpful.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed then, Ben. So handing over to Ruth, if you're ready with your slides.
Indeed. Thank you, Charlotte. I think Sally's going to put my slides up with a bit of luck.
Yes, they are just coming up now, or should be.
Thank you.
Okay.
And you can go on to the first slide, please, Sally. Thank you. Apologies in advance if I'm repeating a little bit of what Ben and Ben have already said. But I thought, for the purposes of today, I would have a quick rummage around and see what tenures are currently on offer. And I've divided them up, okay, I appreciate that they're not all, strictly speaking, different tenures, but there are quite a few different offers out there. And as it says in the slide, we might have outright purchase where we've got limited or no exit fees, standard leasehold purchase, with classic examples, McCarthy and Stone and Churchill. Sorry for anybody else on the call that I haven't mentioned. Service charge paid during ownership and minimal exit fees. An outright purchase with deferred service charge and or exit fees, the New Zealand Australian model with service charges wrapped up into substantial exit fees, possibly with additional exit costs. Then we have OPSO, old person shared ownership, which you'll be familiar with. I've just put on the slide some of the basic criteria, but 55 and over, eligibility criteria, liability of payment of service charges, and otherwise the same as for standard shared ownership. And as for other forms of shared ownership, OPSO is offered on properties delivered as part of the affordable housing programme. I'll come back to part rent, part buy in a second. Rental options, Ben Rosewell mentioned in particular. It seems to me that there are generally sort of two scenarios for rental. One is where there's an option to rent within a building that has outright purchase and OPSO offers in place, and it may be for long-term rent, or it may be with a view to rent to buy. Life Story have something they call choice to buy, where people move in on a rental basis and then have 6 months to instruct a solicitor. I think it's 6 months to complete. So that's one sort of scenario. And then there's just rental only, where perhaps an entire building is owned by an institutional investor or funded by an institutional investor, and is simply for rental purposes. I mentioned part by part rent. So this is shared ownership, but without grant. Sorry, Miranda. Which is we see a little bit of. I think McCarthy and Stone offer this. I'm not sure who else does. I haven't been able to look into everything, but that's one organisation that offers it, and this is without the qualification criteria, etc., because obviously it's not grant funded. Shared equity, also an option, which is outright sale with a fixed equity charge. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Sally. So I thought I would look at OPSO versus part rent, part buy, because we had been focusing on OPSO a little bit. And I mentioned OPSO requiring standard shared ownership eligibility criteria. Previously, we didn't have a model lease for OPSO. We now do under the new HAPPI model with four templates. There's a flat model lease with CPI rent review, a flat model lease with RPI rent review, and the same options for houses. So under the current grant model, we've got in the initial and any subsequent leaseholder must be over 55. They can only have approved occupiers in residence. And the new model offers the 1% staircasing option and the initial repair period with a maximum percentage of 75%. We don't actually deal, as a firm, we don't actually deal with that many new build OXO sales. It's all in the numbers. Again, I think Ben Denton mentioned how few have actually been sold, how few OXO units have been sold, we're not. I don't think we've got any on at this precise moment in time. But we are dealing with a lot of resales, and the resales, especially the older OXO type sites, can be quite difficult to sell. There are probably lots of reasons for this. Others on this call would know better than me, but limited market, seems to be a lot of complaints around high service charges, even though, as Ben mentioned, these are in order to provide additional services. We find that buyers, solicitors, and their other advisors and families tend to be risk averse. So on a resale, there'll be lots of inquiries and often resistance to time pressures. And you know, some of these properties were originally sold in the 1980s, 1990s, and they're often quite complicated provisions in them, which I won't dwell on now. Some sector client feedback really sort of reiterates what I've just said. Limited demand, service charges adding up when it takes a while for a property to be sold, and quite large sums being collected on completion. Some earlier schemes don't have perhaps communal lounges, on-site wardens, etc., and very limited additional services are offered. And they may be in competition with some quite interesting and more expansive new retirement blocks that are on offer these days. Often RPs don't have funds to buy back, so it's just going to be a case of waiting for the right buyer to come along. And a quote from one OXO provider: "I think the retirement market is a difficult market generally, and there can be quite a fine line to judge whether buyers are eligible for shared ownership or should be buying on the open market, bearing in mind they're usually downsizing or have a lot of equity." I thought that was quite an interesting point. Slide 3, please, Sally. So certainly, and again, apologies to anyone from Homes England on the call, but you know, there are other options around non-grant funded part rent, part buy, effectively shared ownership. Obviously, there's funding's needed, so that's going to be quite an important factor. But you can get much greater flexibility than OXO, and that flexibility may enable you to do and improve options and the offering that you can make to your purchasers. It's a question of working out really what people want, isn't it? And again, one of the Bens referred to this earlier, and I think this is where, if you could do the next slide, please, Sally. The shared ownership report is interesting, and hopefully the task force report will be informative. And again, not wanting to repeat, but Ben's point about very few homes being delivered through OXO as at March 2022. And some of the criticisms around the rent liabilities being inequitable. There should be a sliding scale, because the argument is that the last 25% should be rent free, whatever your shareholding, your share is. And service charges, what can be done about that? The amounts that are being passed to families after death, are there other funding options perhaps that might be available? Generally a low level of understanding of OXO, So really recommendations around mandatory to highlight legacy costs and changes to rents in perhaps the kids' forms. And as I say, looking forward to seeing what the task force report tells us and what it thinks might be the options for the provision of greater choice, quality and security of housing for older people. The aim is to unblock challenges. Let's hope so. Thank you very much, and I will pass over to Miranda, I think, yes.
Great, thank you. Sally was going to share my slides as well. Firstly, I thought I'd just start off briefly with who Homes England are, as I know that not everyone on the call will have worked with us. So we're the government's housing and regeneration agency. We work on behalf of our sponsoring department, the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And our role is to support the delivery of housing and placemaking and all of the benefits that come with that to local economic growth and so on. We've got a hugely experienced and skilled and diverse workforce, including architects, civil engineers, economists, finance, town planners, surveyors, and a lot of people should know us for the Affordable Housing Grants Programme, but what Homes England does is more than that. Flick to the next slide. So effectively, we work to our strategic plan, which was relaunched last year, and it's added that emphasis back onto regeneration. And I think a huge part of this for us now is about placemaking, which whenever you look at creating vibrant communities, it's got to include everybody in that. Beyond the homes themselves is the place, the area, the town. Is it easy to navigate? Is it accessible? Is it that these homes are adding something to it? And older persons housing and extra care schemes play a really big role in that placemaking. Particularly, we see some amazing examples in rural areas where extra care schemes can become almost a community hub and take up things that aren't supportable as standalone in a village, for example, but actually can be brought into a scheme where you're bringing lots of residents together. So our strategic plan confirms that refreshed mission and objectives. And I think I won't go through this line by line, but you can see the threads running through this of inclusion of older people is a massive part of looking at homes people need, the well-being side of things, and obviously the knock-on impacts that can have to other departmental budgets of people being in an appropriate home for them. And beyond that, the diversification of the sector, Ben alluded to earlier, the entry of institutional investment, which has been really vital in delivering more affordable homes in particular, but also other things such as build to rent, where it works out as a win-win from an investment perspective, but also delivering the homes that people need. So there are many ways that we intervene, and we work with a huge range of partners. We work with tiny almshouses, and we have large strategic partners delivering 1,000+ homes in the retirement sector, so notably McCarthy Stone. We flick to the next slide. Before we move on to the affordable housing, I did want to highlight some of the other things that we do. Our land and development team work where there is market failure and do things such as land assembly, infrastructure and master planning. This one is an example of a live development that we've got in Warwickshire. And it's a large site for 1,000 new homes. So Homes England needed to intervene. We acquired it based on the local plan, obtained the planning consent and overcame some of the delivery obstacles by directly commissioning the infrastructure. And what that's meant is it's allowed the homes to be delivered via the Section 106 obligations. There are full affordable housing there, community, leisure uses, standalone sites for SME, but also senior living played a big part in this, and that's being delivered. Another way that we work in the away from the grant side of things is on our structured real estate finance. So obviously, as many of you know, it can be tricky in the first sort of few years post-sale, but until event fees start coming in, that operational cost in the interim can be difficult, it can be expensive. There are lots of challenges facing the market in delivering these retirement villages, which can be really valuable to the community still. So in a few examples, we have worked with open market providers to provide them with structured real estate finance, and that's allowed them to bring forward schemes of open market sale homes for that mid-market that sometimes gets missed out. There's sort of really good provision at the top end with your luxury retirement homes. There's good provision for social and affordable rented, but above that there's that bit of a gap, and I think that was really highlighted by the Mayhew review of how important it is to make sure there's provision there. So structured real estate finance is just another way that we support the market. So the next slide is looking at the Affordable Homes Programme. So this is the bit that a lot of people, particularly in the retirement sector, know and love us for. So there's funding for homes through two routes, either strategic partnerships where partners have a large amount agreed up front and flexibility in the delivery, and they will deliver homes. And then there's continuous market engagement, which is for smaller sites. As they come forward, people can bid for individual grant. So affordable and rented tenures and home ownership tenures are covered by this programme, and supported housing in particular is a focus of the AHP, with 10% to be delivered on specialist and supported housing, which does include older persons as well. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at the tenures that we do support through our current AHP. So we have social and affordable rented homes, and also rent to buy. So and then on the homes for sale, there's older person shared ownership and home ownership for people with a long-term disability. So in the social and affordable renter, the rental tenures that would work for the older person's market, rent to buy is for working households, so doesn't really apply to this. But the main things, as people have touched on, are older person shared ownership and hold. Now I'll go through home ownership for long-term disabilities first, because it's much simpler, and then there's lots of things on the older person shared ownership that make it a bit more complex. But beyond people buying OPSO homes directly, for those who have a long-term disability, either above or below retirement age, and it always strikes me as odd that older person shared ownership is from age 55. I think most people would agree that's not necessarily old, as half my team tell me they'd be eligible now and find it quite insulting. But for people with a long-term disability, they can apply for a scheme which allows them to buy an individual home that suits their needs, if there isn't a suitable alternative available for standard shared ownership. And where this is brilliant is keeping people in the communities they live in, maybe near networks and so on. Moving on to OPSO. Now, as Ruth mentioned, there are two routes. People do a shared ownership scheme without grant funding and sort of with slightly different rules, or through older person shared ownership. And I think we actually value all delivery as long as it's transparent, fair and on consistent terms. I think Homes England is there to intervene where the market doesn't work. So where it's working, that's a brilliant addition and more homes. after just a quick rewrite here, as Ben and Ruth have covered a few of the points that I was looking at earlier, but I think it's definitely interesting to look at the outcome of the previous APPG inquiry into older person shared ownership, and the more recent Luck inquiry into shared ownership more generally. And in terms of the policy ownership, this sits with the department, but I think there are definitely some interesting areas to think about for them when they are looking at what to do next. There is this, I guess, inherent unfairness built in with the 25% rent discount only being available to those who can afford the most. It was always designed like that to allow for service charges and so on, and people just not being able to afford the ongoing costs. But it definitely does stick out as an issue. There's also the balance here of viability of changes we make to the rental structure. If changes were to happen to service charges and so on, it all makes it more expensive to deliver, and we've got to strike that balance between making sure that it's fair for customers and that the people who need it can access it, but also having that part around making sure that providers can afford to build it and that it is a reliable, stable product for institutional investment, which is really important. Ruth already touched on the leasehold reform side of things. The one interesting thing that comes up a lot is around event fees, of whether they are or aren't fair, and or deferred management charges, as I know they're called as well. But looking at that balance between making sure that overall the proposition is affordable to customers, making sure that customers who want to use that model and need, are willing to have a lower cost going on, knowing that there'll be deferred management fees or event fees later on, that there's that customer choice. So it's an interesting one to look at. Obviously, there was a previous Law Commission report into event fees, I think back in 2017, and the government accepted all but 2 of its recommendations. So there's sort of I guess, an agreed framework of what good might look like. We just need to think about how that applies to the affordable market. The challenges in resales, I think, as Ruth's picked up, there is an issue there, and it's the thing that sort of hits the postbags most about complaints and so on, is that bit around what's good, or what good looks like now versus what good looked like build wise and environment wise in the 70s, 80s. It's moved on leaps and bounds, and you see some of the newer places with the facilities, and you can see why there's potentially an issue there. We are really keen to work with the task force outcomes, and we've been speaking to the task force, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that one. But within the current structure, there's still a lot that can be done. So the affordability guidance specifically makes provision for the fact that for some people, whilst they might be downsizing and having large amounts of equity, if they need that equity for essential reasons like topping up their pension income or for care costs, for example, it is permissible for people buying OPSO to keep quite large sums of cash available because they need that for an essential purpose. So they can't buy on the open market because they then wouldn't have enough to live on. And I think there are some points around, we've been trying to make things easier for providers, and perhaps an avenue for the point I think Ben made earlier about how do we deal with the fact that older leases are less attractive and it's set once, is we've clarified a lot of the flexibility on being able to buy back a customer shares or buy back the home entirely and then resell it on as shared ownership, and that gives you that sort of break in terms where you can make changes as you need them. And the final point, obviously, is about the key information documents. Transparency and being upfront about all of the fees and all of the costs for both the buyer and potentially the estate later on is really important to us. And we do keep the key information documents under continuous review, and there will be some updates in that, just to really start to highlight what the costs could look like. Again, always a balance between making sure customers have enough information, but equally that they're not overwhelmed by information, and that's the tightrope we're walking at the moment. I think I'm out of time, so I'll skip the development examples, but we have had some fantastic schemes come up for older persons, shared ownership, and for rental, and particularly Wigan Council is a brilliant example of, they commissioned a report from HousingLIN in March 2018, and then they have been working to deal with the increase that uncovered, including things like specialist bungalows, things that allow families to stay together, but also apartments to house people. And it all ties in with that part around sustainable communities and the eco credentials of that as well, of making things so that they're future proofed for when carbon net zero comes. That's all from me. I think we're off to Q&A now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Miranda. Thank you to all of my speakers there. Absolutely fabulous. Really, really interesting. And thank you to those who have put comments in the chat. So to kick off with the question that I wanted to ask, and as I'm chair, I can do this. What do residents want? One for the Bens, I expect. So actually, what is it that people look for, older people look for in a scheme? What is at the forefront of their minds? And you mentioned differences between those looking to buy and those looking to rent. How does that translate into the planning of the delivery of a scheme?
Shall I pick that up to start with? So I think my reflection is it comes right back to the beginning, is the number of choices that people have currently are super limited. I think even through this conversation, it's been really interesting. We look at something that we've got and try and fix it and improve it, which is of course one way to try and do things. The other way, and we do a little bit of this internally, and then we run out of time to think about it. We think, well, actually, if you, given everything we now know over 30, 40, 50 years of tenures that work and then don't work, if we started again, what would we create? Because there is a massive unmet need for housing in this space. The current tenure and funding solutions don't encourage the marketplace to crowd into this space. So I'm a real advocate for saying, so what do we have to, how do we have to think differently and do differently to create tenures that work? So the journey of rent to buy, or then buy to rent, to unwind people's equity as you go through a home. One of the challenges we've seen at the moment, particularly over the last couple of years, is massively high service charges, which have become super noticeable. They were noticeable before, but in this marketplace, they're really, really noticeable now, and that's created affordability issues. So the reflection here is there's a wide variety of different customers with different needs. Some wanting to buy a lifestyle offer, some wanting a functional offer, and we've got to try and start to create a much more diverse and rich marketplace to be able to fill that variety of needs.
If I just ask, I just work with Jenny Pannell, who I think is on the online here, about the idea of try before you buy, giving people the opportunity to rent in a scheme to see if it suits them and their needs. Is that something that you offer in any of your schemes, or something you've ever considered offering?
Yep, no, the try before you buy does exist in in schemes that we deliver from an Inspired Villages perspective. Yeah.
And is it popular? Is that something that people are?
Yes, it's to a certain extent, but it's yes, it does work to a certain extent, but it's not a large proportion of what's demanded.
Thank you. Just for those listening in, Sally has put up into the chat links to a number of the reports that people have mentioned on the call. So please do have a read of those if those pique your interest. Obviously, everybody's very much awaiting the task force publications in due course. So I'm sure that those will be made available to HousingLIN members in due course. A couple of questions in the chat regarding what's working, what's not working, issues regarding council tax where a flat is empty and the cost that people have to pay following an event, an exit from a property, which can also be very, very costly, and they're referencing the very high service charges which can be prevalent in the market. A concern, however, and a couple of people talked about the challenges and particularly the mid-market gap. Concern raised here that the private market isn't working for older private renters. Issues of tenants, tenure security, and rent hikes, as well as many properties being inappropriate. So, a question asked by Claire here: is there any potential for private rental models similar to the social rent model, i.e., reserved for older adults, appropriate build, security of tenure, and like social housing, as rent rises which are limited or linked to inflation? Anybody interested in picking that one up? Always difficult, I think, when you look at market forces versus what does a landlord want? What does a tenant want? Miranda, is that anything that's ever been looked at from a Homes England point of view?
I mean, not specifically for older persons, but we did, when it was sort of nascent, we did invest in a build to rent fund, which was designed to bring those investors in and sort of test the model and increase confidence and so on. So I think, I think throughout all of this, the more options you've got, the better, right? And if there is that gap in the private rented sector, I think we are starting to see build to rent investors come in, and they are long-term stable landlords. They're there specifically designed, it's inbuilt in their business model to keep people happy. I mean, I don't know if Ben has anything to add on that one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, these are all, even the build to rent marketplace is a relatively, it's still in its sort of youthful years. It used to be a massive marketplace, and then it all fell apart in the earlier sort of middle part of last century, and then it's being rebuilt again. And in a way, the older person's marketplace is a much smaller subset of that marketplace. I mean, it's our reflection as we've looked in this space is there's a really strong relationship in terms of a mid-market area and typologies. So typologies that don't create high service charges. And the marketplace hasn't yet evolved to move from, let's say, apartment-led living, let's say, from an older person's perspective, to slightly lower density living that helps you to have more affordable service charges, that then helps affordable rent as a product to work relatively well. I mean, there is a really good point here about trying to have controlled and predictable rents as they increase over time, that therefore are known in terms of their affordability. The challenge is what's not controlled and predictable is service charges, as we've seen over the last couple of years. So coming to a solution where service charges are a much smaller proportion compared to the rental outgoings is a real challenge, which goes to typology and design of these sorts of schemes going forward.
Thank you. Just a question for Ruth. So from the sales point of view, are you finding that people are, not saying you've worked in this industry for a long time, but we both have, so I think we can admit to that. Are you seeing changes in what consumers or purchasers are asking, the sort of questions that they are looking at, and the information that they want when buying a property? particularly in the older person's market?
I suppose that the main thing that stands out is they're very savvy, and there will be a lot of questions around the costs involved in the purchase and the event fees and service charges, etc. So we do get a lot of inquiries coming in around that. Yeah, but generally, I suppose maybe a little bit more caution around the purchasing. But no, not other than that, not really, no.
And another question slightly related to that, how do you change onerous unfair lease clauses? How often are you approached by either the housing association or individuals to seek to vary a lease that's already in existence, so possibly on the buyback or when properties are being sold on? Is this something, and how receptive do your associations tend to be to those sorts of requests?
It's very difficult to generalise. There's so many factors that can be involved, from the provisions of a superior lease to grant funding condition. There's an awful lot involved. We do get asked sometimes. It would be wrong of me to say that there's a tendency one way or the other, because as I say, it's a very complicated situation. But technically, a lease can be changed if the parties agree, and it's something that is permissible under the planning, Section 106, grant funding, whatever it might be. If there's nothing like that in your way, then yes, these clauses can be varied.
Thank you.
I think just to add to that, I think that's one of the key challenges that the sector in the UK faces, and overseas the models have departed, because at the moment the challenge, when you run an operational business, you lease that unit to the resident, that then gets on-sold resident to resident to resident, and as operator you don't have the ability to adjust or modify the lease as residents' needs change or the service provision needs to change. You lock in the service charge and you lock in the terms of that lease. And overseas they've departed away from a leasehold structure. New Zealand, which is often talked about, runs on a license structure. So at the end of each occupation, you can make sure that the next purchase that buys has got a lease or an occupation that is fit for purpose, that reflects what the resident want and need, because these are long-term investments. They're not a one-off sale. The operator will stay there operating into perpetuity, but you're trying to predict the future, what they will need. And even if you get it right today, it could change in a couple of years' time. And we're seeing that already in our portfolio, where the leases that we put in place 4 years ago are already now outdated, because take account something like net zero that's coming in, and you've got to factor that into old buildings. There's just so many moving parts, whether it's the real estate or whether it's the operations. You've got a very rigid real estate structure that's been overlaid over an operational structure. So that's one of the key differences that would make a huge difference if there was some flexibility there.
I think one of the hallmarks of the English and Wales system is this freehold leasehold split, which doesn't really operate across the world. Okay, we're nearly out of time, so just a couple of other points. Anna from Tonic. We've experienced real issues affecting demand for OPSO due to the 55 age criteria when couples have significant age differences. And Anna says this has meant that only the older partner can be the leaseholder, and the younger partner has to give up their housing rights if they've previously owned a home as a couple, but need to move into the OPSO extra care for health reasons. So question there, why do both partners need to be 55 plus in the capital funding guide? And could this not just be one person aged 55 plus? This seems very unfair and resulted in some potential purchasers deciding not to limiting demand. And Miranda, obviously we know you can't talk to why the policy is there, but any thoughts that you can share on that?
So the age limits were there to create specifically a retirement community and not have younger people living there. And I think in terms of changing it, it's tricky, because talking outside of the policy itself. But for example, I think there was a housing ombudsman ruling against a party who did allow younger people to buy, because the people who were already buying in were buying on the basis that it was an over 55s development. Sometimes there's planning as part of it. I mean, having said all of that, it's one of the things that we can take forward with the department to look at of, is there any scope for flex? But a lot of it will be what's the surrounding setup, and would we cause any knock-on issues? But definitely, obviously, the age difference in partners has an impact, and I can see that.
Excellent. And just time for a couple of final questions. Questions to the Bens. Have you ever brainstormed a new tenure options with your large financial services and insurance arm? E.g. the equity release, life insurance, care home fees, product designers and actuarial colleagues. It seems the real estate world is very myopic when it comes to a whole life financial housing and care solution. Lots of nodding.
Yes, we do. I think the challenge we tend to find is to what extent can you scale something up, which clearly, given all of the interest that's here, there's a lot of interest. And then the second one is there's this usual question, well, will government change what currently exists and support something new, which is always an interesting question, because here we're trying to make a product more affordable to a group of customers, and somewhere, whether it's through the planning system or through land or through grant or some sort of subsidies, there needs to be some sort of subsidy in the system to help create things that are more affordable.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you to those attending. Thank you to my esteemed panel. Wonderful chairing you as ever. I pass over to Jeremy for the final sign off.
Charlotte, thanks very much. While I struggle to unmute myself, thank you very much for chairing this afternoon's session, and thank you again to all the presenters for your fantastic contributions. As Sally said at the outset, this session has been recorded, and we'll be sharing the information about how to view it again, or to share amongst your own colleagues to watch along with the resources and the slides, hopefully in a couple of days' time. If this is your first attendance at a happy hour, we try and run these virtually every Tuesday afternoon. Next week is looking at designing housing for people with a learning disability and autistic people. It builds on what Miranda was talking about, I suppose, the hold, and Ruth, you mentioned hold as well. So that may well come through in the session next week. But for now, can I thank everybody, Winkle Sherwood, for again sponsoring and supporting this session, and Sally and the team behind the scenes for making the happy hour possible. So wish you all a really pleasant afternoon and evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.